All right, recording is going. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Nolan. And now that the screen is shuffled around as more people have joined, on my left and my right are Rob and Bill. The three of us run this monthly meetup called SAC Interactive. We meet right here in Zoom the third Wednesday of every month. It's always free. It's always open to everyone who wants to join. The topic has something to do with web and or mobile development. The topics will be beginner, intermediate, or expert, just depending on what the thing is we're discussing that month and whoever the particular speaker happens to be. We're always looking for people that would like to present to the group. So if you'd like to give a demo of something you've been working on or teach someone how to use a new technology or whatever, please hit us up in the chat. And on the other side of that, we're always looking for suggestions on new topics people would like to see presented by someone else. So if you have a suggestion for a thing, please also let us know about that in the chat. And the last thing in the chat that I'd like to talk to you about is we have a monthly email list that we send messages out to, just letting folks know about the meetup, what the topic is going to be from month to month, and that sort of thing. If you'd like to be on our email list, if you'd be so kind as to just shoot me a message in the chat, I can see that you're added to that list. I promise we don't spam people. We send about one, maybe two messages a month, just letting folks know what's going on with the group. And that's it. And our speaker this month, Mr. Bill Mead, going to give a great talk about 25 years of CSS and all kinds of wonderful web design awesomeness that goes along with that. Bill, you ready?
I am ready.
I'm going to see here. We got the recording going. I think you're all set. The floor is yours, my friend.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Nolan, you need to enable screen sharing for me, please.
Oh, sure. 1 second. No, I forgot something. Now you should be all set.
Okay, great. I'll get this going here, and what's the other thing I need to share here? This one here. Share sound too. All right, there we go. Oh my goodness. All right, there we go. Can everybody hear me and see what's going on here?
I think you're good. Good.
Okay. All right. Again, my name is Bill Mead, and I'm at WM Mead on most social medias. I'm not very social these days, but this talk is really about 25 years of creating layout on the web. We'll look at some specific examples on CSS Grid and sort of see where we're going next with sort of layout for the web. And I should preface it by saying that this talk is very much from my own personal experience and perspective. Your mileage may vary. It's kind of hard to believe I've been making websites for 25 years, but there it is. So I hope you have fun and kind of enjoy this sort of ride. The idea is to sort of give us a sense of where we've been and where we are, and sort of look at all of the different things along the way. And kind of a common theme is it's, making the web do stuff has sort of been, one part awesome and two parts cautionary tale in most cases. And we'll sort of see that play out with a lot of stuff as we've been trying to make the web do stuff, do certain things as we go along. So starting back in the early days of the web, for those of you who were there for it, we had tables. And of course, some of you probably guessed we were starting here. But yeah, tables and using HTML to kind of make this sort of thing, to sort of try to create layout. And it didn't take us long to, really kind of make a mess of that. We got pretty good at making a mess of that. But we were able to sort of get things to kind of go on the page where we wanted them to go. And then along with that, we were doing a lot of slicing of images. For those of you who might remember those fun days, we were doing, we were using ImageReady. I don't know if anybody remembers that. And doing this kind of thing. along with this kind of thing, pretty ugly and hideous. But you know, it was pretty rudimentary. But in spite of these things, some of us managed to make some pretty interesting stuff. Um, you know, here's an example of something that was kind of interesting. Um, and let's see. Here's another one. Here's another one. I thought that was kind of cool to capture. I remember this one from back in the day. This was kind of inspirational at the time. And this kind of thing. And if you go to this web design museum, you know, I spent a couple of weekends researching and putting together this presentation, and had a lot of fun kind of looking stuff up. And there's a lot of great stuff on here from times gone by for layout and stuff on the web. So this is kind of a great resource to kind of look and see that sort of stuff. But I mean, the big problem with using tables and slicing images and doing all that sort of stuff is, you know, our code and our web pages and our files kind of ended up looking kind of like this. All the credit to Steve Mahalo for creating this crazy image, you know, but it was kind of a mess. And yes, sort of like Excel spreadsheets on the web, you know, and trying to find things and fix things and figure out where stuff was amidst a pile of TDs and TRs and all that stuff. Sliced images, if you spell the word wrong, you have to go make another slice. And oh my God, it was just kind of a mess. So we did that, and that was fun. And then, you know, kind of on a side note, but there was also Flash. Not really so much specifically about layout, but for a long time we had Flash and could make sort of very interactive, media-rich things with Flash, which was really kind of cool. And that was fun. And I remember teaching this stuff, and I know Ron taught a lot of classes with Flash, and we did a lot of really interesting stuff with this thing. Kind of another example from that web design history website. Kind of things you can do with Flash back in the day. If I can get to the next slide here. You know, then the iPhone came out, and everybody, you know, people wanted Flash in the iPhone, but Steve Jobs said no, and that was really kind of that was the end of that. So, you know, and I remember when I used to teach those classes, you would find like art, musician websites or movie websites had a lot of rich Flash media stuff. And I remember teaching it one quarter and then like a couple quarters later teaching it again. And you know, there just weren't any examples. It just really was kind of overnight that stuff kind of disappeared from the web, which was kind of interesting. So there was Flash, and, you know, also from the early days, after we kind of gave up on table-based layouts, the next thing that came along that we were working with was with floats. And I have 2005 to 2017 on here, more or less. It's kind of hard to put dates on these things because it's kind of hard to track exactly when things started being supported enough by browsers to really use them. But floats were and are kind of a solid technique to use to create websites and create layouts. You could float stuff left. You could float stuff right. And that was about it. You know, of course, we had the problem where, you know, you'd have a container and you'd float something in it, and you had to, you know, you had to make that container contain the floats, which led to some interesting hacks, such as the clear fix. Some of you will fondly remember the clear fixed hack. And, you know, again, this is us trying to make the web do do things that it wasn't really intended to do. And if you have a cat and you want a bunny, well, you know, we can make that work, right? So that was always kind of fun. The next thing with floats is it didn't take us long to recognize that you can make whole layouts by floating things, not just having images with text wrap around them. So we could have our floated content over on the side and do that kind of thing. But and it was kind of cool because, like, you know, you could tell it to float left, or you could tell it to float right. You could change your layout kind of instantaneously with just a little bit of CSS. But if you wanted that sort of sidebar to go all the way down to the bottom, you know, like this, and really fill up that column, well, that meant you needed to have some more hacks, you know, in order to get that kind of thing to work. And we did an awful lot with, you know, faux column techniques and these kinds of things to try to get stuff going. You make a 1 pixel image and have it repeat down the page to kind of get that sort of thing to happen. Kind of, it worked, but it was kind of hacky. So those are float layouts, and we used those for quite a long time. The other thing that was really useful to help us with layout on the web was positioning. So, you know, we could position something with an X on an X and Y axis, and we could do all kinds of cool stuff with that and kind of put things wherever we want. So it makes sense that before very long, people started to think, well, let's just use positioning for everything. And that led to things like Adobe Muse, which was around for a little while, which, I mean, it's kind of understandable, the idea of like, oh, well, you know, we can just like make a bunch of elements, stick them on the page and put them where we want. And who cares really what the markup looks like behind there? I mean, we don't really look at the markup for an InDesign document or the markup of a Microsoft Word document. But it just turns out that for the web, like, it's just not that great an idea because of accessibility and because we want to be able to edit the stuff. And if you looked at the code this thing made, it was just a mess. And then there was responsive design, and that made it even worse. And, you know, it was ultimately it was kind of just more of this. Kind of back to here again with kind of just that sort of mess of stuff going on. However, with between floats and positioning, we could build just about any kind of layout. It took some ingenuity to make it work, but we could do it. You know, and there's this example here, or this example, or this example, or this example. You know, we could make it work. It just took some ingenuity to kind of get these layouts to kind of work and do what we wanted them to do. Of course, doing all that meant having, you know, lots of divs inside of divs inside of divs inside of divs, and really, yeah, sure, maybe we weren't sort of resorting to tables and that mess, but is this really any better? No, kind of just more of this. So that was hard, but fun. And then because it was hard to do that kind of thing, that's what sort of led to the rise of CSS frameworks. Initially, we had Blueprint CSS and 960 Grid system. And the images that I showed from the other page are actually right off of the 960 Grid system website. These two were not responsive, so they didn't last for very long, but the idea of, well, if you can plug in a bunch of CSS that other people have written and it provides you kind of with a grid using floats that you could just put classes on things and create layouts with that, well, that would be pretty cool. And then along after that came, you know, Foundation, and of course the big one that's still extremely popular today, Bootstrap. It's important to note, though, that even before, you know, for a long time, long before we had responsive design and that kind of stuff going on, there were designers who were really thinking about the web as something that should be flexible and designed to use the flexible space of the browser, but the early versions of that were really pretty rudimentary and ugly. And I don't know if anybody remembers this kind of thing, but you could open and make this browser wider or skinnier, and the middle section would stretch and squish, and it was pretty rudimentary and not very nice, but it did kind of work. And as early as 2003, people were talking about this thing called liquid layouts, where you use percentages for things to try to create these kinds of layouts. And I remember Dreamweaver back in the day having these horrible templates that were called liquid layouts. But the problem was that the browser just wasn't really there yet, and images would bust out of the boxes, and it just didn't really stick yet. So, in 2007, Steve Jobs introduces the iPhone, which kind of changes everything. We already mentioned that with what happened with Flash. And, as usual, we as a people tend to walk into the future backwards, looking at the past. And, I remember Steve Jobs presenting this and talking about how cool it was to have the web on your phone, and you could pinch and zoom and do all of this stuff to kind of get actual web pages on your phone. And it took us a solid 3 years before we recognized that really the layout that we want to have on our phone is not the same layout that we want to have in other places. Like for desktops and that sort of stuff. Ethan Marcotte wrote this article on fluid grids in 2009 on a list apart, and was really kind of revisiting that notion of the sort of flexible liquid layout ideas. And that led him to 2010, when he wrote this article on responsive web design. So this is kind of the birth of responsive web design, is this article. And in this article, he had an example. I think I have it here. No, where is it? Was it this one? No. Oh yes, this one here. So he had this example here built into the article. And if you can go back to that article, and as you resize this, the layout changes using a combination of sort of the flexible grid stuff, and by now the images can shrink with their containers. Browsers are now supporting that, and you can have breakpoints or media queries where you can actually end up with a different layout and different design. You can decide what elements you want to keep or throw away at different layers and that kind of stuff. And so that was really kind of the birth of responsive design, and being able to sort of do some different things with layout, which was pretty cool back in 2010. That's where we were with that. And for a while, that seemed like it was going to be a pretty exciting thing. I need to find some more examples of this for this presentation, but there were for a while websites you could go to sort of see what people were doing with different layouts for different web pages, and it was pretty exciting. But the fact is that in 2010 we were still pretty much restricted to floats and absolute positioning as techniques to use for the most part, and it was hard to do all of that stuff. When you think about taking a web page and designing it in at least 3 different sort of layouts, it becomes a lot of work to make every single page. So we ended up with a lot more of this again. So where did that take us? Well, it took us into kind of some pretty dark times as far as I'm concerned in terms of layout on the web. Which persists to this day. I call it the wedding invitationification of the web, where we just freaking center everything, because we can squish that down and make it into a column, or we can make it wider, and everything's balanced and centered. It's just kind of the most basic, most simple way of getting balance is to center everything. which makes sense for a wedding invitation. Like, two people are getting married. You want to convey that kind of stability. But on the web, we could do a lot more interesting things with layout. It's just because it was hard, we tended not to. And if you could make it look sort of hipstery, well, that's all good and great and fine. Just make it look sort of hipstery and everything will be kind of cool with that. And everybody should be all happy with that. So that led to a lot of websites that we still see today, this kind of thing, or this kind of thing, or this kind of thing, where everything's just kind of centered and it can, look sort of hipstery. It kind of hide the fact that the layout is really pretty boring. Marco put in the chat CSS Zen Garden. That was definitely a great tool back in the day for recognizing some of the different things you could do with layout and with CSS with the same markup, which is really kind of cool. Yes, I should have put that in here. Good call. But that brings us to Flexbox and Grid, kind of up to this time, where these are kind of our next tools to talk about. But before we talk about Flexbox and Grid, I just want to mention a couple side things that I thought were kind of interesting about layout for the web. The first was this notion of display table. I remember playing around with this back in the early, 2010, 2011, trying to create layouts with display table. And you could set up an element to display as a table, even though it wasn't a table. You weren't using table tags, and then elements could become, cells within the elements inside that element could become cells in the table, and you could do some interesting things with that. But there were some weird glitches across browsers. It didn't always work quite right, although it was great in certain instances where you wanted to vertically align stuff. You could set that element to display as a table, and you could actually use CSS to vertically align stuff inside of there. And this is kind of a neat article that sort of goes through and talks about like some of this stuff from, I think this article is from 2014. But, display table had that table moniker, which, people still were suffering from some PTSD of building stuff at tables. So even though you weren't actually using table markup, it was just never really going to pan out, I think. Using anything called tables is just going to be really kind of problematic for people, getting them past that. Even though if you look at a grid today, you could say, well, that's kind of a table. So there's that one. So that was kind of fun. The next thing after that that's worth mentioning is the multi-column layout, which seemed like when that became available, I remember playing around with it and being like, okay, this is going to be our solution. You could set up elements to display as multi-column, and then you could do layouts like a newspaper where text would go down the column and then go over to the next column and so on and so forth. In reality, it didn't turn out to be that great. And part of the problem was that, reading down the page and scrolling down the page and scrolling back up the top of the page to get to the next column is not a great user experience on the web. But there are times when you can actually make some interesting use of this. And there's this great Smashing Magazine article from Rachel Andrew who kind of goes into this stuff. And one of the things, you can do some really cool stuff with this. One of the things she points out is this great webpage from Verl here, where she's creating kind of a masonry kind of look by using multi-col layout. The only problem with this is that your content goes down the page, your content order goes down the page. So from an SEO perspective, it's not that great to have, this thing up here that's up at the top be like the fifth thing on the page. But we'll come back to we'll come back to that a bit later, the whole masonry stuff, because that's kind of a neat thing to talk about and think about. So there was that one. Okay, so with that stuff out of the way, we can really talk about CSS Grid a bit and Flexbox. And you know, where I started using Flexbox was in 2017. Bootstrap 4 was in beta, and they had replaced their float-based grid system with the Flexbox-based system. And when I noticed that, I was like, you know what? It's probably time to jump on the Flexbox bus at this point and to really learn Flexbox and start using it. If browsers are supporting enough that Bootstrap can switch over, then we're probably there. And in fact, I was probably, a year or two late to the party, which is kind of the story of my life anyway, but probably could have done it in 2014 or 2015, or I think as early as 2014, but maybe not quite that early. But yeah, so we could start going with Flexbox there. And we had Flexbox a couple years before Grid. The Grid specification was really being supported by most browsers by around 2020. So we had about 3 years where we were sort of using Flexbox to create layouts without Grid. But really, when we think about the difference between Flexbox and Grid, the main thing that we need to keep in mind is that Grid is for layout and Flexbox is for alignment. And while it's certainly possible with Flex Wrap to use Flexbox to wrap around and create a grid-like layout, as seen here in this example, it's probably better to use Grid for grids and to use Flexbox. If you're using Flex Wrap, chances are you could probably use Grid instead. And it might be worth switching over to do that at this point. Interesting, both of these two specifications, the author for both of them was this guy, Tab Atkins, and you can go on YouTube and see videos of him speaking at conferences and stuff like that about the development of both Flexbox and Grid. And they both have kind of developed over time, and that's kind of cool to kind of see that stuff and see the guy who wrote the specification sort of talk about it and that kind of stuff. Really pretty interesting. So I'm not going to go into a lot of very specific details about specific features of Flexbox and Grid. There's a lot of tutorials out there. A meetup is not a great place to sort of learn every feature and all that kind of stuff, but just some basic things and a few tips that will really kind of help us out as we look at some examples for this. Generally speaking, with both Flexbox and Grid, you set the parent element to either display Flex or display Grid, and then the children becomes Flex items or Grid items and will behave accordingly. So if I set this section to display Flex or display Grid, then these articles become Flex items or Grid things, Grid items. And conversely, you can also set the children, it won't affect the grandchildren. So here, the paragraphs here are not going to be Flex items if the section is a Flex box. Just these two will be, or a Grid. So these won't be. But you can set a Flex item or a Grid item to also display as a Grid. Display as Grid or display as Flex, which means then its children become Flex items. So you can kind of nest these things and work with them in and out. There is something coming we'll talk about in a little bit called subgrid, which is pretty interesting. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes at the end here. But that kind of gets us to where we're going. Okay, so now we're going to look at a few examples that kind of takes me through the history part of this. And I have a few examples that we can look at. And if you want to download them and look at them yourself, since you don't have access to this slide deck yet, I'm going to put the link to the zip file in the chat window over here. And if you want to download them and unzip them, you can, or you can just kind of watch as we kind of go along here. So examples 1 and 2, let me just sort of bring up my Visual Studio Code here. And I don't need these release notes or my get started window here, but I'm going to just look in example 1. We've got a file here, and I'm just going to use the live server, go live, to open that sucker up. And here we have, kind of an obvious, straightforward grid where we've got a bunch of cards in a row here, in 2 rows here, sort of being displayed. And we can go over and look at the basic CSS that makes this thing up. I'm having a hard time locating there it is, Visual Studio Code icon here. So you can see over here I have my main element here, and then I've got these cards inside of here, and over here you can see I've got main set up to display as a grid, and I've got these columns here, 1FR, 1FR, for 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1 fraction. Gap, this is kind of nice now, so you can just set a gap, so you don't have to worry about padding and margin and all that kind of crap between your elements. You can just set a gap. And gap now works with Flexbox, which is great. That was added, I think, around 2020. That started really being supported in Flexbox. So that's, when I first started using Flexbox, it wasn't there, and you still had to use margins to sort of create your gutters and stuff. So that's kind of nice. So we've got this card stuff here. But inevitably, going back and looking at this here, you would look at this and sort of say, well, wouldn't it make sense? Like, these buttons look kind of weird, kind of higgledy-piggledy all over the place here. Wouldn't they be nice if they were kind of at the bottom and centered of each of these? Well, that's not a layout thing. That is an alignment thing. So that's where we would use Flexbox. So going back here again, I have these 2 rules here, and you can comment these if you want. I'm just going to uncomment these 2 rules here. So I've got card display flex. I'm setting the direction to column. And then the actual button itself, I'm saying self-align, align self to center, and margin top auto will just push it down to the bottom of that card. So just by doing that and pressing save, come over here and boom, my buttons are in the center at the bottom. So that's pretty nifty. So this is kind of a good example of how Flexbox and Grid can work together. And so you just have to remember to use Flexbox for alignment and Grid for layout. So there's that one. Now, inevitably, you end up with some sort of grid, and it's very nice if it sort of works out evenly with rows of 3. But then what happens if you've got 1 card or 2 cards at the end? So if we look at example 2 over here, I'll close that and go to example 2. Example 2, you can see down here, I have commented out an article here at the end. So I'm going to end up with, I've got 3 rows here on this one. So I've got 3 rows, got that one commented out, and I'm going to end up with something that doesn't quite line up. But it does. Look at that. How do we do this? How do we do this kind of thing with the example 2? So if you go looking up how to deal with these orphans and stuff, and not only that, but I could actually add one more. I've got card 7 there. Let me see, what did I do with this? Probably should have left this in a different state here, but card 7. If I uncomment card 8, you'll notice even with 2, I come back and look at that. So those are kind of centered. Now, if you go looking up how to do this kind of thing, you'll get people telling you, well, just use Flexbox. But really, we want to use Grid for layout rather than Flexbox. So how do we do that with Grid? And the magic is a couple of things that are really kind of important here. Down here at the bottom, okay, so dealing with 2 items, I've got this kind of crazy pseudo class thing that will allow me to sort of get them to display properly. And then with one orphan, I've got this one here. So these will kind of deal with them and put them on the grid in the right place. But the grid has actually changed. Notice up here when I go to when we look at my main element here, where'd it go? Main. Grid template columns repeat 6. So instead of typing 1FR, 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 I have repeat 6. So my grid is actually 6 columns here. If I inspect this page and click on my grid, you can see that there are 6 columns here. And the cards are spanning 2 columns each. So you have to sort of think about, like, okay, if I want to end up with 1 in the center, I need to have a grid that's going to sort of accommodate that so I can put it on the grid. And if I'm going to have 2, I need to be able to split them between the 2. Going back to my slides here, I kind of have it illustrated here, where we start like that, and then we have 1 orphan or 2 orphans, or we want it kind of in the center. There it is, yeah. So we have 6 columns here, and we're kind of placing that in the center to get that to work, or 2 orphans like that. So kind of one of the things that I think is really important about grid, and one of the important takeaways of this sort of presentation, is that if you're going to work with grid, you have to really plan your grids out and think about them in terms of how it's going to work there. Number of potential cards in row determine number of columns. It's not just the number of cards, but it's the number of cards plus like how you want to possibly lay them out in there. So you have to really think about, like, not just the content you have, but the content you could possibly have in the future. And this is, I think, one of the most challenging things about working with grid, is that you have to sort of draw it out and sort of think about what you're going to need for your content up front. Goodbye, Katie. Katie's messaging me. She has to go. Okay, so that's examples 1 and 2. For example 3, I want to pay close attention to this min-max property. And there's a really great article here. I think it's this one here. Yeah, min-max. That sort of does kind of a deep dive into min-max. I stole this image off of here. But min-max allows you to sort of control the way a particular element displays. So if we come back over here and look at example 3 really quickly, and I'm just going to open that up in Live Server over here. And the difference here is that this grid is responsive. So if I choose Inspect and squish this thing down, you'll notice it goes from 3 columns to 2 columns to 1 column. And there's no media queries here at all. So the magic that's making this happen is this min-max property, which is really pretty cool. Because if you have kind of a grid layout and you don't want to deal with making a whole bunch of media queries and additional rules to make stuff lay out properly for different size things, you can actually do this with grid to a certain extent with certain types of layouts. Maybe not every layout, but yeah. So looking at this over here to kind of see how that works, I have down here display grid, grid template columns, repeat, auto fit, min max 300 pixels, 1FR. So these elements are going to be 300 pixels wide at a minimum, or 1 fraction at a maximum. And auto fit says if they don't, if at 300 pixels it doesn't fit, then wrap it down to the next line. So that's where we're getting this kind of, once we get less than 900 pixels here, it doesn't fit. So it wraps it down to the next line. So now these are fitting 2 on a line here, and then and they're wider because they're fitting 1 FR. And then when they get down to less than 600 pixels wide here, you can't fit them anymore, so it goes down to 1 column. So that's pretty neat that you can do that kind of thing, and kind of a neat thing to look at. So another sort of point here is to sort of play around with some of these features, particularly the min-max and the auto-fit stuff is kind of awesome to play around with and sort of see what you can do with, experiment with some of that stuff, see if you can get some interesting things happening. So that's example 3. The last 3 examples I have are really just showing some neat stuff that you can do with Grid. Example 4 is also mentioned in that article I just showed, but also I got it from this article. This guy does kind of a nice job of sort of talking about what you could do to make a full width article where some content is full width and some content is fitting in the screen here. Which is kind of you can certainly do this without Grid, but you end up with extra markup. So if we go and look at example 4 here, you can see my markup is really straightforward. I have images, and some elements are set to class full bleed, and then I just have content, just normal content, H1s, paragraphs, H2s, paragraphs. I don't have any extra divs or anything else like that. And if I open this up in my live server here, you'll see that the items that have full bleed on them do a full bleed to the edge, and the items that don't are in the middle of the page and sort of constrained to fit, which is kind of a awesome, fun thing. And again, you could have done this with putting divs around this stuff and using margin auto and setting the width on that, and then keeping these images outside of there. But it's kind of nice to be able to do this kind of thing without the extra divs. And again, we're trying to stay away from that image of all the houses all over the place, the Steve Mahalo image of the crazy houses. I like these crazy houses better. I think these are kind of cool looking. So that's kind of a neat thing. Let's just take a look really quickly at how that's done over here. And again, this is making use of the min-max thing. So if we go and look at our page here, I've got my wrapper, which is set to display grid. The wrapper is holding the entire page here. I've got where's my wrapper? Oh, that was main. Oh, now I'm confused. Grid template columns. Another thing that's kind of neat that I wanted to point out about this one here is you can, coming back here, I have a wrapper there, but where'd my actual wrapper go? Well,
hey,
anyway.
Bill.
Yeah?
I think you're looking at the example 2 index.html.
That makes sense. My example 2 index. Let's go to example 4. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I got main class wrapper. There we go. So it's the wrapper there. But also I wanted to show you really quickly that if I inspect here and shrink this down for mobile, my text is running right up against the sides here. So I can, again, with the min-max, you could do something for mobile where these pictures shrink down. But the text is running right up against the side here. Now, I could fix that by messing with some padding, but since we're talking about layout with grid, there is this really nice little thing that I can do here. This one here, if I uncomment this one out and comment this one out instead. So what this is doing, it's a little bit more complicated to look at, which is why I left it commented out. But the middle here is using the calc thing to set it to 100% minus 5 characters. So instead of setting my min to 65 characters, I'm actually setting it to 60 and taking 5 characters. And by the way, the CH is a character width, so you're actually paying attention to numbers of characters, which can work out pretty nicely for typography. But I'm subtracting 5 characters out, and it gets kind of centered in there. So if I save that and then come back, and that should have refreshed automatically. Now when I size it down, I've got some margins on the side, which is kind of nice for those pieces. So that's kind of cool. So that's example 4. Example 5, I just wanted to play around with some different things. I had seen something on the web, and I forget where, about using grid as a as kind of a mask. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to sort of play around with that idea and see if you could use grid as a mask for stuff here. And by the way, if you're wondering about this picture with the houses, this comes from this, it's not really a game, it's an app you can download on your phone that I've been completely addicted to, where you can build these little towns. And it's not really a game because it doesn't have any purpose other than to just make pretty little towns. And I love all the little details and stuff. That was really kind of cool. So I thought this was kind of a neat idea of something you could do with grid that's kind of different and allows you to create some different kinds of layout. And essentially, if we go look at the HTML for this is a little bit messy because I've got basically a 12 by 12 grid here on this page. So I have a whole bunch of divs, and I've given a class of clear to the ones that I want showing up that are there. And then where I have an element like this that's going to take up a bunch of spaces, I've commented out the divs because it's setting up to span a bunch of divs to go through there. So the markup here is maybe not quite so nice. You know, I've added an article in here and that kind of stuff, and you can go look at the CSS and play around with that. This presentation is getting a little bit long, so I'm going to not get into it too much, but you're welcome to download this and play around with it and make your own version of it and do your own cool things with it. We'll talk about the last one. The last one, I also had seen some stuff online about this, and I'd been really wanting to play with this for a while, so it was really kind of fun to get it to work. But I thought it would be really fun to do something with grid and sort of isometric perspective stuff. So if I open this one up with Live Server, I've got this grid that's got this sort of, it's using 3D perspective on a grid to kind of capture, you know, to kind of create something like this. And, you know, this is kind of an interesting thing to sort of see where you could go with this sort of thing in the future. And it took me quite a while to get the perspective to actually work the way I want it to work and have it actually stretch and squish properly and stay in place. That was kind of a trick to kind of get that to do that. And it involved using a lot of viewport width measurements instead of like pixels or percentages or any of that other kind of stuff. If you go look in the CSS over here, getting that perspective stuff to work involved using a lot of viewport width pieces to kind of get that to go into place. It took a lot of kind of messing around with that to get it to line up, but I thought it was really kind of cool and sort of interesting and fun to see something like this. And you could do some really cool sort of interactive things with this if you wanted to as well. Okay, so those are the examples that I have. I do have a couple more things to talk about really quickly at the end here in terms of where we're going. And again, kind of just to reinforce the important points. When to use grid. Grid is for layout. Flexbox is for alignment. plan your grid, think about the content you have in the future, not just the content you have now. Grid settings and properties, play around with those, especially min-max, auto, and auto fit. You can do some interesting, weird stuff with that. Minimize your markup. Look for opportunities where you can get rid of extra divs and extra markup and make your markup cleaner and more succinct and more semantic. I think that's always excellent. Be experimental. Find ways of combining grid with other ideas. I think there's all sorts of cool stuff out there. And of course, watch the smart people. I don't come up with a lot of these ideas myself. Keep poking around and seeing what smart people are doing out there. That Rachel Andrews is a really good person to watch, or Jen Simmons, or Smashing Magazine, or A List Apart. These are all really great resources where people are posting sort of fun, interesting stuff up there. So what's next with Grid? Subgrid, I mentioned it very briefly earlier. This is sort of an issue that people are having problems with. And the issue with subgrid is, if you want to create sort of a grid of stuff, the grandchildren don't align on the grid. So as you see here, like these columns, this thing has a longer title, so all of a sudden it throws stuff off. So subgrid is going to be a way of being able to have grandchildren follow the grandparents' grid, so that you can have a more consistent layout and be able to do, this kind of thing more easily. But not yet, unless you're in Firefox. Sorry. So subgrid is coming. And then masonry is also one of those things. We mentioned it earlier. We had that sort of great example, and that links to this article here. Again, Rachel Andrew talking about masonry, and here's her thing on or Pinterest kind of layout sort of thing. And there is a feature coming to Grid. This article was written in like 2020 or something like that. The masonry feature of Grid template rows masonry. Even though this article is like a couple years old, still no, not supported. So hopefully these things are coming and will give us even more things to rejoice about and have fun with doing layout stuff for the web. And here we are just about an hour in, and I'm done. Mic drop. Questions?
Thank you, Bill. That was awesome.
Thoughts? Do you have any resources you recommend for learning CSS that you prefer? I mean, I like that this Josh Camus website. He often has really good stuff posted on here. Rachel Andrews is a really great person to follow. There's Smashing Magazine is fantastic, always. Marco, I know you've written articles for Smashing Magazine. Marco's in the audience. He's a great resource for stuff. So I would look at things like that. Are there resources you could recommend in keeping up in the latest developments in web design, technical perspective? So it's those ones again. Those are great questions. Feel free to unmute yourself, and if you have any questions or thoughts or ideas. Go ahead. Trisha.
Hey, it's been a long time.
I miss you.
Yeah. So I have a question about Grid. So how would you so what are the available websites where you can experiment with Grid?
There's a lot of them out there. There's some great sort of game type websites where you can there's like this leapfrog grid game. if you Google around, you will find some good stuff like that. And there's websites that will actually help you generate grids. They'll generate the CSS for you. You kind of draw the grid on the screen, and then it'll actually generate the CSS for you for that grid. So there's a lot of those kinds of resources out there. I should have probably linked to some of those in my slide deck, but I didn't. Oh, and by the way, if you want the slide deck, I will copy and paste the URL for that and put it in the chat as well.